It only took 60 seconds. Just one quiet minute beneath the redwood skies of Northern California, for everything Claire Jensen thought she understood about wild animals, about motherhood, and about love, was to change. The morning had been unremarkable. The kind of soft spring morning where the sunlight filters through pine needles like golden thread, and time moves slowly in the woods. Claire, a wildlife therapist and single mom, was folding laundry inside their hand-built wooden cabin on the edge of Willow Creek. Her 15-month-old daughter, Mira, sat happily on a thick quilt spread out on the grass, babbling to her stuffed bunny. Just a few feet away, basking in the dappled warmth, lounged Luna, a bobcat with amber eyes and a past far rougher than this moment suggested. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a strange harmony, a wild predator lying so close to a toddler. But to Claire, it was a fragile balance carefully built over time, a daily act of faith and instinct. And she never left them alone. Except today. Just once. Just 1 minute. She stepped inside. The sun is still warm, the baby is still giggling, the bobcat still sleeping. Nothing out of place, until a scream from outside shattered the stillness. What happened next defied everything Claire believed about the boundary between wild and domestic, between animal and family. And what Luna did that day, it wasn't survival. It wasn't training, it was something else. Something deeper, something unforgettable. This is the story of that day, but more than that. It's a story of a connection few people ever witness, a bond between a child and a wildcat, between protector and protected, and the quiet, invisible threads that tie our lives to something greater than we understand. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit the notification bell, because this is a story that may change how you see the wild forever. And now, let's go back to where it all began. Luna wasn't supposed to live. That's what the forest ranger had said when he brought her in, cradled in an old flannel shirt like a secret too fragile for the world. She was barely the size of a mitten, her eyes sealed shut, her breath shallow, and one hind leg bent at an unnatural angle. The ranger had found her just off a trail near Fern Hollow, beneath a fallen log that bore scratch marks and blood. No sign of the mother, no sign of siblings. Just one broken baby bobcat in the stillness of morning fog. Claire Jensen had been working at the Willow Creek Wildlife Haven for nearly 7 years, but this case was different. Most wild kittens arrived with a fighting spirit, with a hiss, with a snarl, something untamed pulsing just beneath the skin. But not Luna. She made no sound when they cleaned her wounds. She didn't flinch when they splinted her leg. She didn't resist the feeding tube or the IV. She just watched, blinking slowly, her golden eyes too old for her tiny face. Claire had seen eyes like that before, on older animals, the ones who had survived winters alone, who had seen fire and storm and things they couldn't name. For the first 2 nights, they didn't think Luna would make it. Her temperature dipped dangerously low. Her tiny chest rose and fell like a candle flickering in the wind. But Claire stayed close, swaddling her in warm towels, whispering into her ear, even though she knew bobcats couldn't understand human words. Still, it felt wrong to let her go without someone saying, "Stay. Please stay." On the 3rd night, Luna opened her eyes. That morning, Claire arrived early to check vitals, and found the tiny bobcat staring up at her through the mesh incubator, ears twitching ever so slightly. Claire laughed, cried, then immediately checked her breathing, her reflexes, and her IV. Everything was holding steady. That was the beginning of what Claire would later call the slow defiance of statistics. In most cases, bobcat kittens found alone don't survive. They depend on their mothers, not just for warmth and milk, but for touch, for grooming, for the constant vigilance that comes from generations of wild knowledge. Wildlife centers always aimed for rehabilitation and release. But in rare cases, when survival in the wild was impossible, Some animals stayed. Claire had worked with a few. A red-tailed hawk blind in one eye, a coyote missing a leg, a raccoon with neurological tremors, but never a bobcat, and never one quite like Luna. From the beginning, Luna broke the mold. At 4 weeks, she began walking despite her splint, dragging her leg behind her, but determined to reach the edge of her small enclosure. She didn't meow or chirp like most kittens. She made no sounds at all unless startled, but she watched everything, especially Claire. During feeding times, other baby animals would scramble and fight for food. Luna waited, patient, still. Her eyes never left Claire's face. It unnerved the interns at first. This tiny predator with the gaze of something far older, far wiser. When she was strong enough, Claire moved her to an outdoor enclosure with logs, climbing branches, and small animal toys meant to simulate hunting behaviors. Luna explored it slowly. She'd touch everything once, then return to her resting spot and simply observe, for hours. It was this quiet, observant nature that convinced Claire to foster Luna at home when the haven reached capacity that spring. The goal was still the same: raise her, strengthen her, and if at all possible, release her. But deep down, Claire had her doubts. Bobcats raised in captivity, even with minimal human contact, rarely adapt to life in the wild. And Luna had never been wild in the first place. She was born into trauma, into silence. Her instincts were intact, yes, but something about her was different. She didn't run from humans. She didn't seek affection either, just presence, like she was studying them as much as they were studying her. Claire had a small enclosed yard attached to her back porch, reinforced with chain link and topped with mesh, a space originally meant for short-term recovery. She moved Luna there at 5 months old, giving her more space to climb, dig, and sunbathe. Inside the house, she kept her world quiet and safe. Mira was still too small to walk, and Claire always kept the baby at a distance when Luna was around. Not out of fear, but out of respect. You never assume a wild animal will act domesticated, not even the quiet ones. But something remarkable began to unfold. At dusk, when Claire rocked Mira to sleep by the window, Luna would often curl up just outside, a silent silhouette against the dying light. When Mira cried in the night, Luna paced, not frantic, just alert, almost restless. And once, when Mira let out a sharp yelp during teething, Claire found Luna pressed up against the back door, staring into the house, unmoving. It was never overt, never something Claire could definitively call attachment. But it was there, subtle as wind, this invisible thread forming between a mother, her child, and a creature never meant to belong. Looking back, Claire would often say that Luna didn't bond in the way dogs do. She didn't nuzzle or wag her tail or ask to be touched, but she stayed. That was her way. She chose presence. And maybe that was the first lesson Luna taught Claire, that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and constant, like breath, like a shadow that never leaves. Claire had learned plenty about wildlife behavior in textbooks, but Luna reminded her that real connection, wild or not, isn't something you can train or measure. It's something you feel, if you're still enough to notice. By the time Luna reached her first year, her leg had healed with a slight limp. She would never hunt like her wild cousins, and that sealed her fate. She couldn't be released. The decision was heartbreaking, but Luna didn't seem to mourn the loss of the wild. She had already carved out her version of it, watching the forest from behind the safety of the enclosure, listening, sniffing the wind, remaining part of the landscape while no longer needing to survive it. Some might say she lost her freedom, but to Claire, it felt more like Luna had chosen a different kind of life, a life that held space for healing, for observation, for the kind of quiet connection few people ever experience with creatures of the wild. What Claire didn't know, what no textbook or research paper could have predicted, was that this quiet, half-wild, half-domestic animal was about to risk everything, not to survive, but to protect. And what happened next would change not just their family, but the very way Claire understood what it meant to belong. Let's move forward to the little cabin at the forest's edge, where one ordinary spring day was about to become anything but. The house wasn't large. Most people who passed it assumed it was just another aging cabin tucked into the redwood-lined back roads of Northern California. But to Claire Jensen, it was a world. It was safety. It was where wild met warmth, not in conflict, but in harmony. Built decades earlier by Claire's late husband, Thomas, the cabin stood on 2 acres of land, skirting the edge of Willow Creek's old-growth forest. There was no gate, no manicured lawn, only a winding dirt path that led past ferns, moss-covered logs, and eventually opened into a clearing where the cabin's cedar siding soaked in the morning light. After Thomas's accident in the Cascades, Claire couldn't bring herself to leave it. Their daughter Mira was only 3 months old then, and though every creaking floorboard reminded her of what was gone, the walls also held memories she couldn't let go of. Inside, the house was quiet, filled with the kind of gentle stillness that only comes when nature is your closest neighbor. Claire worked remotely as a wildlife therapist for the Pacific Rehabilitation Network, consulting with smaller sanctuaries across the state. Her days were a delicate rhythm of typing reports, bottle-feeding orphaned raccoons, and rocking Mira to sleep. And then there was Luna. Luna had her own space, a reinforced outdoor enclosure connected to the back of the house through a gated wooden tunnel. It was half-shaded, full of climbable logs, rocks, and a small pool fed by a garden hose. But most days, Luna preferred lying near the sliding glass door, where she could observe everything inside. She never tried to come in, not unless invited. It was one of the small, almost eerie ways she respected boundaries. Claire had read all the literature. She knew the cautionary tales. Wild animals don't belong in homes. They will turn on you. They are unpredictable, untamable, unsafe. And those warnings weren't wrong. They were based on real incidents, hard lessons. But what most people didn't understand was that Claire never brought Luna into her life as a pet. Luna wasn't a substitute for a dog. She wasn't a therapy animal or a novelty. She was a being with her world, her own story, her rhythms. Claire didn't try to change her. She simply made space for her. Every routine in their home reflected that respect. When Mira began crawling, Claire installed soft barriers to ensure the child didn't wander into Luna's enclosure. When it was Luna's feeding time, Claire kept it consistent. No hand feeding, no cuddling, no baby talk. Luna got raw meat cut to size, placed on a stone slab outside the tunnel. And when Luna had no appetite, which sometimes happened after thunderstorms, Claire gave her space. No coaxing, no assuming. Still, despite these professional boundaries, there were moments, unexpected and quiet, that made Claire stop and wonder whether something deeper was happening, like the time Mira had her first fever. It was a rough night. Claire sat on the floor of the nursery, holding her burning, whimpering daughter, half asleep herself. She heard the soft thump of paws on wood and looked up to see Luna sitting at the screen door, her eyes locked on them, unmoving, present. She stayed there until sunrise. It happened again a few weeks later when Mira fell and scraped her knee near the porch. She cried out, more startled than hurt. Before Claire could even scoop her up, Luna was pacing along the inside of her enclosure, head low, tail twitching, visibly agitated. She made no sound, but her body spoke volumes. Of course, Claire never let her guard down. No matter how long Luna had been around, she remained cautious. There were never unsupervised moments between Luna and Mira. Even when Luna began curling up beside the playpen, always just outside the fence, Claire watched like a hawk. She wasn't interested in proving something to the world. She wasn't trying to create viral videos of babies cuddling wildcats. Her goal was simple: provide a safe, respectful space for both her daughter and this injured creature who, for whatever reason, had chosen not to leave. One thing Claire learned quickly, especially after losing Thomas, was that people often misunderstand the purpose of quiet spaces. They see a simple cabin and think lonely. They see a woman with a child and a bobcat and think eccentric. But what they don't see is the depth of care, the intentional choices, the silent agreements that form between living beings who share the same space without demanding too much from each other. In town, people would ask questions with raised eyebrows. "You still have that wildcat? Isn't that dangerous with the baby?" Claire never took offense. Most folks weren't being unkind, they were just unsure. So she'd smile and say, "She doesn't live with us. We live alongside her." That usually quieted them. One of Claire's favorite sayings came from her mentor, a gray-bearded biologist named Dale. "The most respectful thing you can do for a wild animal is to expect nothing from it." That philosophy guided every decision she made with Luna. No tricks, no expectations of loyalty or affection, just space, routine, observation, and trust. Trust earned slowly, day by day. Over time, Mira began noticing Luna more. She'd crawl toward the glass door, press her little hands against it, and babble in that musical toddler language. Luna, in turn, would sit a few feet away, ears twitching, eyes focused, but never threatening. It wasn't affection, it wasn't bonding in the way we define it. But it was something, some form of coexisting awareness that made Claire's chest tighten with awe. There's a deep lesson in that kind of relationship. In a world that often celebrates control, owning, taming, shaping, Luna taught Claire the value of letting something remain wild in your presence. Not controlling it, not fearing it, just making room for it. Some days, Claire still doubted herself. Was she doing the right thing? Was she selfish for not sending Luna to a sanctuary farther away? But then she'd see the bobcat's quiet gaze follow Mira as the child toddled across the porch. See the way Luna stayed at a distance, yet always near, and feel a strange peace settle in her bones. Because this home, this not-quite household, had become something rare. A space where the wild could breathe without being hunted, where a mother could grieve and heal without rushing, and where a child could grow up learning that not all love is loud. Sometimes it watches you from the edge of the woods, fiercely quiet and fiercely loyal. Claire didn't know then that this balance, this careful harmony, was about to be tested most terrifyingly. That one afternoon, something from the forest would come not in silence, but in violence. And the creature who never asked to belong would make a choice no one saw coming. Let's step into that moment now, the 60 seconds that would change all their lives. The day began like any other. A soft breeze curled through the redwood trees that bordered Claire Jensen's home, carrying the sweet scent of pine sap and blooming ferns. Mira was teething but in good spirits, content to sit on her favorite quilt spread out beneath the sycamore tree just beyond the porch. She was giggling, one of those open, bell-like laughs that made Claire pause, even in the middle of folding laundry, just to smile. Luna was nearby, curled along the edge of her outdoor enclosure in her usual way, half asleep, yet somehow always alert. The afternoon sunlight dappled across her spotted coat, and her tufted ears twitched occasionally at the murmur of the forest. Claire felt calm that day. The kind of calm that only comes after months of routine, after trust is built through careful boundaries and endless observation. Her world was simple but meaningful. Work from her laptop at the kitchen table, keep an eye on Mira through the big back window, and make sure Luna had what she needed. That day, the chores were light. She'd watered the garden, prepared lunch, and was halfway through sorting warm clothes from the dryer. And then she made a decision, a small one, the kind that takes no thought at all. "I'll just grab the mail," she said aloud, to no one in particular. The mailbox sat at the edge of the property, just a short walk down the gravel path that cut through wild blackberry bushes and low-growing manzanita. Claire hesitated only for a second. Mira was safe, giggling to herself, pulling at the ears of her plush bunny. Luna was where she always was. It would take less than a minute. Claire wiped her hands on a dish towel, stepped into her boots by the door, and walked down the path. It took exactly 60 seconds. She would remember that number for the rest of her life. The moment Claire turned back toward the house, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No bird song, no breeze, just a thick, pulsing silence that seemed to reach right into her chest. Then she heard it, Mira's voice, no longer laughing but sharp and surprised, followed by a low growl. A sound Claire had only heard once before when Luna had encountered a coyote near the enclosure fence. But this time, it was closer. Too close. She dropped the mail and ran. Rounding the side of the cabin, Claire's breath caught in her throat. Mira was no longer on the blanket. The bunny lay abandoned on its side. And 10 feet from the play area, Luna stood rigid, body low, hackles raised. She was between Mira and something else, something moving, a blur of gray and teeth, thin, ragged, foaming at the mouth. A coyote. Claire had dealt with coyotes before. They were common in the area, usually shy and easily spooked, but not this one. Its movements were erratic, unnatural, its eyes glazed, and it had crossed the yard, the porch rail, the smell of humans, everything wild instincts should have warned it against. Mira had been its target, and Luna had put herself in the way. The two animals circled each other, Luna low and calculated, the coyote twitching with each breath. Claire's body moved before her mind caught up. She grabbed the metal rake leaning against the porch and shouted, running toward the scene. The coyote lunged. Luna met it head-on. The impact knocked them both sideways, a blur of fur and claws and snarling. Mira screamed. Claire scooped her daughter into her arms and backed away, heart pounding so hard she could barely think. She reached the porch, Mira clinging to her shirt, and turned to see Luna staggering to her feet. The coyote was limping now, bleeding from its side. It turned, snarled once more, then disappeared into the underbrush. Luna didn't chase it. She stood there, panting, her back leg trembling. Claire rushed to her. Up close, the wounds were obvious. Luna's left shoulder had deep gashes, one ear was torn, and there was blood matting the fur along her neck. But she was alive, and somehow still alert, her eyes trained on Mira. She had held the line. Claire wanted to cry, scream, or collapse. But there was no time for that. She moved into action the way only a wildlife professional and mother can, fast, focused, and painfully calm. She secured Mira inside the cabin, locked the doors, and then returned with the carrier, a towel, and gloves. Luna didn't resist. She limped into the carrier with effort, her golden eyes never leaving Claire's. The drive to the vet clinic felt longer than it ever had. Mira was quiet in the back seat, chewing on her bunny's ear. Claire's hands trembled on the wheel. She couldn't stop seeing it, the way Luna had stood over her daughter, the way she had thrown herself into danger without hesitation. No training could explain that, no instinct. That wasn't territory defense, that wasn't food aggression. That was a choice. At the clinic, Dr. Patel and his team worked quickly. Luna was sedated, stitched, and treated. The vet confirmed what Claire suspected. The coyote had likely been rabid. The risk of infection was high, and Luna would need multiple rounds of medication, close monitoring, and isolation during the worst of it. "She'll make it," Dr. Patel said softly. But that wasn't a wild response. That was something else. Claire nodded, unable to find words. Back at home that night, after Mira was asleep, Claire stood at the sliding door and stared out into the darkness. The stars blinked softly overhead. The night air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Luna's enclosure was empty. She would remain at the clinic for at least a week. The yard felt colder without her. Claire's mind replayed every second of what had happened, her choice to walk away for just a moment, the scream, the coyote, Luna. She couldn't stop thinking, what if Luna hadn't been there? What if the quiet trust they'd built hadn't existed? What if this wild creature, who owed her nothing, hadn't chosen to act? There was a lesson in that, one that had nothing to do with animal behavior or training protocols. It was a lesson in presence, in watching, in the kind of loyalty that isn't taught but felt. Claire had believed for so long that her job was to heal wild things and let them go. But Luna had turned that belief upside down. Maybe sometimes the wild chose to stay, not out of need, but out of something more enduring, something like family. What she didn't know was that Luna's actions had already begun to ripple through the community, and that in the days ahead, the story of what happened on that quiet spring afternoon would reach further than she ever imagined. Let's step into what came next, the questions, the disbelief, and the quiet awe that followed, when the wild became a guardian. The news traveled faster than Claire expected. It started with a brief call to her closest neighbor, Mrs. Langford, simply to explain why the road to the clinic might be unusually busy. But by the end of the week, everyone from the local ranger station to the Willow Creek Elementary School librarian had heard about the bobcat that fought off a rabid coyote to save a toddler. Some retold it with awe, others with skepticism, and a few with concern. But the story had taken on a life of its own. At the vet clinic, Luna was quiet but stable. The wounds were deep, but she responded well to treatment. Dr. Patel administered antibiotics and started the full course of rabies prophylaxis, just to be safe. Despite the pain, Luna remained strangely composed. She never hissed, never lashed out. Even when sedated, her eyes would find Claire and hold there, as if reminding her, I did what needed to be done. Now you do the same. Claire visited every day, sometimes with Mira in tow. The little girl would press her face to the glass of Luna's recovery room and babble softly, pointing excitedly if Luna so much as shifted her ears. The bond between them hadn't changed. It had only deepened. Claire could feel it in the way Mira's voice softened near Luna, and in the way Luna seemed to relax slightly when Mira's scent was in the room. Still, not everyone understood. 2 days after the incident, Claire received a call from the local Wildlife Oversight Committee. A formal review had been triggered. While Luna had all the necessary permits as a non-releasable educational animal, her presence in a residential setting, especially after a publicized attack involving another predator, was now being questioned. I understand the concern, Claire said calmly during the meeting. But Luna wasn't the threat. She was the one who stopped it. A young man on the committee, barely out of graduate school, looked skeptical. But don't you see? That's what makes this more complicated. This wasn't a case of passive coexistence. Your bobcat acted on behalf of a human child. That's unusual, unpredictable. Claire wanted to laugh or cry. Yes, she said gently. And isn't that exactly why it matters? She showed them the footage from her outdoor camera. The grainy black and white clip clearly capturing Luna placing herself between Mira and the coyote, her body low, protective, unwavering. There was no aggression until the coyote lunged. No mistaken intent, just action, and a price paid for it. Even Dr. Patel weighed in with a written statement, calling Luna's behavior highly atypical but not necessarily dangerous, noting that her response had been defensive and measured, remarkably so for an animal with her history. Privately, he told Claire, I've worked with captive wildlife for 20 years. I've never seen a bobcat respond this way. There's no protocol for what Luna did. No way to explain it in textbook terms. It wasn't instinct, it was a choice. The town split into quiet factions. At the coffee shop, some praised Claire for her bravery, while others whispered about the risks of raising a child alongside a predator. One anonymous note left in her mailbox read, "Next time, it won't be a coyote." She threw it away. But for every doubter, there was someone who reached out with warmth. A teacher from the local elementary school dropped off a handmade card signed by 20 second graders, each drawing Luna with sparkles and hearts. One little boy wrote, "Thank you for being brave for the baby. I think you're a good cat even if you are wild." That card stayed on Claire's fridge. Through it all, Claire remained focused on Luna's recovery. The stitches held. The muscle in her shoulder would take weeks to rebuild, but she began eating again, resting peacefully. On day 12, she purred for the first time. Soft, low, not the purr of a house cat, but a deeper vibration that rumbled through her chest like distant thunder. It was a sound Claire had only heard once before, on the day they had removed Luna's cast after her broken leg had healed a year ago. When Luna was finally cleared to return home, Claire made adjustments. She reinforced the outer fencing, added motion-triggered lights, and installed a second layer of screening near Mira's play area. Not because she feared Luna, but because the forest wasn't predictable. She couldn't rely on lightning not to strike twice, but she could control the preparedness of the home Luna had helped protect. What lingered most wasn't fear, it was awe. Claire found herself watching old footage of Luna at rest. The way she carried herself, even in stillness, as though she understood something no human had told her. She remembered a moment just 3 weeks earlier when Mira had been fussy and Claire, worn out, had simply sat on the porch in silence. Luna had approached, not close, just within sight, and sat facing them. That night, Mira had fallen asleep quickly in Claire's arms. It was small, too small to report, but now it felt like a pattern. Luna had not chosen to love loudly. She had chosen to love through presence. The deeper Claire reflected, the clearer it became. Luna hadn't just acted as a wild creature reacting to threat. She had acted as a guardian, and with that came a shift, not just in how Claire saw Luna, but how she saw the wild itself. So often, people believe that wild means dangerous, that nature is cruel, untamed, something to be feared or fenced out. But Claire now understood something deeper. The wild is capable of discernment, of devotion, of defense. And sometimes, when we are quiet enough to listen, it chooses us. Luna had been given a second chance at life, but she had also given one. In protecting Mira, she had redrawn the invisible boundary between species, between roles. She was no longer just a rescued animal. She had become a protector. And yet the story wasn't finished, because even as Luna healed and as Mira returned to her giggles and backyard play, something new began to form, not just in Claire's heart, but in the world around her. Academics began reaching out. A professor of animal cognition from UC Davis requested an interview. Wildlife publications asked for a case study. The story had taken root, not as a controversy, but as a conversation. What does it mean when the wild chooses to protect? And perhaps more importantly, how do we choose to respond? Claire wasn't interested in fame or lectures, but she did believe stories mattered, and this story was changing lives, including hers. Now let's take a step back in time, to the moment Claire first began to suspect Luna wasn't just a survivor, but something far more mysterious. A moment from a stormy night, quiet and easily missed, but one that might explain everything that followed. Claire had always believed in science. As a wildlife therapist with 2 decades of field experience and a background in animal behavior, she leaned on data, case studies, and the comforting logic of the natural order. She understood how wild animals responded to stimuli, what instincts governed their choices, and how behavior could be predicted through evolutionary patterns. But Luna, this quiet, watchful bobcat, had started to poke gentle holes in that understanding. It began with the questions. After news of the coyote incident spread, Claire started receiving emails from wildlife centers across the country. Some were curious, others skeptical. A behavioral ecologist from Oregon asked for a timeline of events and requested Luna's response patterns during her recovery. A professor from UC Davis proposed an observational study offering to install remote cameras to track nonverbal cues. One particularly enthusiastic researcher even asked if Claire would consider DNA testing to see if Luna carried any unique traits tied to temperament. Claire appreciated the interest. These were smart, passionate people trying to do what she had always done: find structure, reason, patterns in the chaos of the wild. But when she tried to answer their questions, she kept circling back to one problem. There was no data that could explain why Luna chose to protect Mira. There were no measurable variables, no precedent, no formula to predict it. According to everything Claire had studied, Luna should have stayed back, hidden, or escaped when the coyote arrived. At best, she might have hissed. At worst, she might have panicked, but to intervene, to fight, to position her body between a child and death, that didn't fit into any scientific framework. Behavioral models for wild felines categorize actions into three categories: survival, reproduction, and territory. Luna's action matched none of them. Mira wasn't her offspring. The yard wasn't truly her territory, certainly not enough to justify risking her life, and there was no self-preservation in rushing toward a rabid animal. So Claire began asking herself different questions, softer ones, less about biology, more about story. What if the answer didn't lie in the textbooks? What if Luna had made a choice not because of instinct, but because of a relationship? Of course, to say that out loud in an academic setting would be professional suicide. Personifying animal behavior was often considered naive, even dangerous. It encouraged people to see wild creatures as furry humans instead of the complex, self-willed beings they are. Claire understood that risk deeply. She had spent her life drawing the line between respect and projection, but this wasn't about projecting human emotions onto Luna. It was about acknowledging that perhaps animals feel things we haven't yet learned to measure. After the attack, Claire spent hours rewatching old footage, Luna's movements in the yard, her gaze, the way she watched Mira with what could only be described as patience. In one clip, Mira had fallen while toddling near the sandbox, and Luna, several yards away, had slowly risen, taken a step forward, then stopped when Claire appeared. She had stayed back, but she had noticed. She had cared. Claire started looking into other cases. She found a story from Colorado. A rescued mountain lion named Careless had once nudged his handler out of the path of a falling branch. In Montana, a coyote raised in captivity had barked and drawn attention to a fire starting near a sanctuary trailer. And in a rare, documented case from 2014, a fox raised at a rehab center had reportedly curled up against a crying toddler who had wandered away from camp, staying with her through the night until she was found. The scientific community labeled such stories as anecdotal anomalies, but Claire knew better. They were stories, and stories have power when science reaches its limits. They remind us that the world isn't built entirely from rules and measurements, that some connections, even between species, run deeper than we know, that animals, like people, can act out of something closer to empathy than we're often willing to admit. Of course, empathy is a loaded word in the world of animal behavior. It implies inner life, emotional awareness, and intentionality. But what if, just what if, those things weren't as uniquely human as we've been taught? Luna wasn't a pet. She didn't seek affection, didn't wag her tail or respond to her name. But she was aware. She observed. She adapted. She chose presence. And perhaps, most astonishingly, she chose to intervene. Claire often thought about a quiet morning, weeks before the attack, when Mira had a low-grade fever. The toddler had been whiny and restless. Claire had settled her on the porch with cool water and toys, trying to keep her comfortable. Luna had approached the edge of her enclosure, sat down, and simply watched. For over an hour, no pacing, no climbing, just stillness. That day, when Mira drifted to sleep on Claire's chest, Luna remained until the sun dipped low, only then retreating to a shaded perch. Was that behavior instinctual, protective, or was it something else entirely? Some form of recognition? In that moment, Claire realized something. Science is meant to explore the known, but story is where we explore the not yet known, where we hold space for the miraculous, the unmeasurable. We ask the kinds of questions that data hasn't caught up to. And Luna was a story in motion, a wild animal who stepped beyond her role, beyond her instincts, and offered something we didn't think wildness could: care. The lesson Claire learned wasn't to abandon science, but to let story live alongside it, to allow for the possibility that love, in all its forms, might extend past our definitions. That protection isn't always about ownership or species or logic. Sometimes it's just about being there when it matters most. She didn't need to prove Luna's behavior. The act spoke for itself, and those who were ready to listen didn't need charts. They only needed to look into Luna's eyes. Still, one question lingered. When did this bond begin? For all the moments Claire had noticed Luna's watchfulness, there was one night that stood out, a night long before the coyote, a night when Luna had shown something unusual, something that, in hindsight, might have been the first spark of the guardian she would become. And so now, let's go back to that night, the storm, the silence, and the moment Claire first began to wonder if Luna saw more than any of them knew. Certain nights slip through memory like fog, quiet and uneventful. And then some nights linger, nights that stitch themselves into the fabric of your life without asking. For Claire, one such night arrived in late winter, 2 months before the coyote, before the headlines, before the world would start asking questions she couldn't easily answer. It had been raining for hours, the kind of slow, relentless rain that softens the soil and hushes the forest. The temperature had dropped just enough to leave a chill in the bones, and Mira, then barely over a year old, had come down with her first real cold. Nothing serious, just a low-grade fever, a runny nose, and that kind of clinginess only a sick child can express. Claire had cancelled her morning calls, brewed ginger tea, and set up a nest of blankets on the couch so Mira could nap where she could be held easily, soothed quickly. By evening, the rain turned to wind. Trees groaned in the distance. The power flickered once, then again. Mira was finally asleep in her crib after a long day of whimpering and restlessness. Claire, exhausted but alert, tiptoed down the hall to check the front door to secure the last latch on the shed outside. As she passed the back window on her way, something made her stop. Luna was sitting outside, not in her usual perch beneath the cedar overhang, but in the open, in the middle of her enclosure, fully exposed to the wind and cold. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't restless. She was still, unnervingly still. Her eyes were locked on the back of the house, on Mira's window as if she could see through the walls. Claire frowned. She had seen Luna weather rain before. The Bobcat had always preferred a perch high and dry when storms rolled in, but this was different. Claire watched as Luna sat like a statue, ears tilted forward, muscles taut, not fearful, but ready. She turned and headed back down the hall to Mira's room. And there, just as she opened the door, she heard it, a thud, then a creak, then silence. It came from the far end of the house, near the back porch. Claire froze. Mira stirred in her crib but didn't wake. Holding her breath, Claire reached for the baby monitor, flipped on the porch camera. The grainy night vision showed nothing out of the ordinary until she adjusted the angle. There it was. Movement, just past the edge of the enclosure. At first, she thought it was a bear, but the shape was wrong. Smaller, lower, a dark, loping figure, a coyote perhaps, or something more elusive, maybe a bobcat's cousin. Claire couldn't tell, but what struck her wasn't the presence of the animal. It was Luna's response. The bobcat hadn't moved. She didn't bolt. She didn't hide. She stood, turned slowly to face the threat, and held her ground. The camera didn't have sound, but Claire could feel the tension. Luna's posture was protective, not defensive. She wasn't guarding her space. She was watching something behind her, watching the house. Claire felt a chill crawl up her spine. She checked all the locks, peeked out the front and back windows, and eventually, after the movement faded into the trees, returned to Mira's room. Her daughter was still asleep, arms splayed in that limp, trust-filled way toddlers sleep when they know their world is safe. Claire turned on the small nightlight shaped like a moon and sat in the rocker near the crib. She didn't know why. Something in her wanted to be still, to keep watch, just as Luna had. Eventually, she fell asleep there, a blanket draped over her shoulders. By morning, the storm had passed. The ground was thick with puddles. Claire walked out to check Luna and found the bobcat on her usual log perch, eyes half closed, grooming one paw. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No scratches, no signs of stress. But when Claire approached the enclosure, Luna lifted her head and met her eyes with an intensity that stopped Claire in her tracks. It was a look of recognition. Later, when reviewing the footage more closely, Claire realized that Luna had remained in the center of the enclosure for nearly 40 minutes, longer than any typical alert behavior. And during that entire time, she had not once turned her back on the house. That night planted something in Claire's mind, a seed of a question. Could Luna have sensed danger? Did she recognize Mira's vulnerability even then? Was there some invisible thread that told her, stay close tonight? Science would call it a coincidence, behavioral instinct, a high alert pattern in response to scent or sound. But Claire felt something else, something quieter. She believed even then that Luna had made a choice. This, Claire would later realize, was the night Luna changed. Or perhaps it was the night Claire changed, because from that moment forward, she began to see the bobcat not just as an animal recovering from injury, but as a presence in their lives. A watcher, a quiet sentinel. It wasn't about assigning human traits. Luna didn't become a pet. She never meowed for food, never curled in anyone's lap, but she became part of the rhythm. Her behavior shifted subtly, spending more time near Mira's playpen, sleeping closer to the side of the enclosure that faced Mira's window. She no longer reacted to Mira's cries with mild curiosity, but with visible alertness. Claire began journaling Luna's patterns, not for research, but for herself, because something unspoken was unfolding and she didn't want to miss it. There's a lesson in that kind of noticing, a reminder that not everything meaningful announces itself loudly. Some connections whisper their way into our lives, revealed only through a slow accumulation of quiet moments. That night didn't make headlines. There were no witnesses, no cameras beyond the one she kept on the porch. But it was the night before everything. The night Claire first felt the possibility that Luna wasn't just surviving. She was watching. And in that silent, wind-swept hour, Claire had watched her back. 2 months later, Luna would do it again, but this time with claws and fury and all the courage the wild could muster. And yet, even after that act of courage, even after the pain and the healing, Luna had one more lesson to give. One final, quiet gesture. A moment so small, it could have gone unnoticed. But for Claire and Mira, it said everything. Let's step into that moment now, a scene of gratitude, of giving, and of something that might just be called love. The morning was unremarkable, the kind that slips by without asking for attention. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees in soft golden ribbons, and a gentle breeze stirred the petals of wildflowers growing near the porch. It had been 3 weeks since Luna returned from the clinic, and though her movements were slower, more measured, there was a strength returning to her step. The wounds from the coyote attack had scabbed over and begun to fade, leaving behind thin traces in her fur, reminders of the price she had paid. Claire had just finished cleaning up after breakfast. Mira, now 15 months old and more curious than ever, was busy stacking brightly colored wooden blocks into impossible towers before knocking them down with a delighted squeal. Luna was lying in the sun on the far side of the enclosure, eyes half closed, tail flicking lazily every few seconds. Everything felt calm again, almost normal. But then something happened. Claire wasn't even looking when it began. She was rinsing a mug at the sink when she heard the sliding door bump lightly against its frame. She turned, expecting Mira to be pointing or babbling as she often did. Instead, she saw something else entirely. Mira was standing at the edge of her little playpen, one small hand grasping the mesh wall for balance. On the other hand, she held a wooden block, green, with a picture of a pine tree etched into its surface. She held it up, arm extended, reaching out toward the glass door that faced Luna's enclosure. "Luna," she said, clear and sure. Not babbled, not mumbled. Said. Claire paused. On the other side of the glass, Luna raised her head, her ears flicked forward. Then, slowly, she stood up and walked toward the door, not urgently, but with intent. She stopped just a few feet away, separated from the child only by pain and frame. Mira didn't flinch. She pressed the block against the glass as if offering it, her cheeks puffed with joy. Luna sat, watched. And then something remarkable happened. She turned her head slightly and, from the side of her mouth, nudged forward a small object. Claire stepped closer to see. It was a pine cone. Nothing special, not at first glance. But Claire recognized it. This pine cone had been inside the enclosure for weeks. She remembered it because of the unusual twist in its shape, like it had grown sideways and spiraled in on itself. Mira had once picked it up near the porch and tossed it toward Luna's fence with a giggle. It hadn't meant anything then. Just a baby playing with the world. But now, Luna was returning it. She didn't bat it around. She didn't chew or paw at it like a toy. She simply placed it in front of her, directly in Mira's line of sight. Then she looked up. Not at the child this time, but at Claire, and held that gaze. It lasted only seconds, but Claire felt something shift inside her. The moment was so quiet, so gentle, and yet it said everything. In the weeks since the incident, Claire had watched Luna grow physically stronger, but she hadn't expected a shift emotionally. She thought the bond had reached its peak the day Luna stood between Mira and danger. But this was something else. A gesture, a small act of return. Not a trick, not mimicry, not reward-driven behavior. It was a gift. It reminded Claire of something she had read years earlier in an essay by a Native American naturalist. The piece spoke of how certain animals leave tokens, not for food or gain, but as part of a silent language. A fox might place feathers near a den it feels connected to. Crows have been known to return shiny objects to humans who feed them kindly. It wasn't transactional. It was relational. This, Claire believed, was Luna's version of that. A pine cone, the very one tossed in laughter weeks ago. returned, gently, deliberately. That night, as she tucked Mira into bed, Claire reflected on what she'd seen. Not just the exchange of objects, but the exchange of presence. Luna didn't need to offer anything. She had already given more than anyone could ask, but she did, and not to Claire, to Mira. It was her way of saying, perhaps, "I see you. I remember. You matter." In a world that often dismisses the emotional lives of animals, that tiny gesture held immeasurable weight. Not because it proved anything, but it reminded Claire that gratitude doesn't always come in words or grand gestures. Sometimes it's a pine cone, a look, a choice to remain close when every instinct might say, "Walk away." And that became the lesson. That when we slow down enough to notice, when we stop trying to make animals fit into our frameworks and just let them be, they often show us more than we imagined. They speak a language not of dominance or dependence, but of presence. And in that presence, there is deep meaning. Mira eventually fell asleep, her little hands curled into fists around the stuffed bunny that had survived countless backyard adventures. Claire stepped out onto the porch, cup of tea in hand, and found Luna once again curled near the edge of the enclosure, just within sight of Mira's bedroom window. She sat down, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and breathed in the silence. There were no words between them, but there was peace. And tomorrow, she knew, would bring more questions, more visitors, more requests from researchers curious about Luna's behavior. But for tonight, there was only stillness. A child is asleep. A bobcat was watching over her, and a pine cone, now resting on the porch rail, is a symbol of something ancient and wordless. Still, one final piece remained in this story. Because while Luna had become guardian, companion, and, perhaps, friend, what mattered most was not just what she had done, but what it revealed about the lines between wild and home, between instinct and choice, and the space we create when we let the wild live beside us. So let's take one last step into this journey, the closing reflection of a mother, a child, and the silent guardian who stayed. There was no moment when Claire Jensen officially declared Luna part of the family. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no photo on the mantle, no labels or titles exchanged. The bobcat never slept inside the house, never wore a collar or responded to her name the way a pet might. But something unspoken had taken root, an invisible thread, so fine it could be mistaken for nothing at all, yet strong enough to bind hearts that beat in different languages. Claire often thought of that thread when she watched Mira play. The toddler's world was simple: blocks, laughter, blueberries smeared across chubby cheeks. But always nearby, never too close, never too far, was Luna. Not hovering, not guarding in the traditional sense, just present, a constant, quiet pulse in the background of their lives. Some mornings, Mira would toddle out to the edge of the playpen, press her face against the mesh, and whisper the only two-syllable name she could say clearly: Luna. And some afternoons, Claire would catch Luna gazing through the trees, ears twitching not from prey or sound, but from something internal, as if she were listening to a frequency only she could hear. Their connection wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the stuff of fairy tales or viral videos. It was slow, grounded, and respectful. And that was what made it extraordinary. In the months following the coyote attack, Claire received more attention than she ever wanted. Wildlife magazines reached out. A documentary crew from Oregon offered to film a segment on unexpected animal loyalty. A university sent a formal request to study Luna's neurobehavioral patterns over time. Claire declined them all, not out of secrecy or defensiveness, but out of care. She had spent years teaching the public to respect wild animals, to observe, not possess. Luna wasn't a case study. She wasn't a mascot for interspecies bonding. She was a being who had survived, adapted, and, at some crucial, unknowable point, chosen to stay. What mattered wasn't what science could extract from her, but what people could feel through her story. The story of a mother who didn't expect to raise her daughter in the company of a wild creature. The story of a child too young to understand fear, who instead grew up believing that the spotted figure beyond the glass was just part of her world, as natural as clouds or wind. And the story of a bobcat who, against everything she had endured, opened herself to connection. One warm evening in late summer, Claire sat on the porch with Mira in her lap. The light was golden, the kind that settles over the forest like a soft sigh. Luna lay stretched out in her enclosure, her coat now fully healed, her movements relaxed but attentive. Mira clapped her hands and pointed. "Luna," she said brightly. Claire smiled. "She's watching you," she whispered, like she always does. That night, after Mira had been tucked into bed and the stars had begun to peek through the canopy, Claire sat alone with a journal in her hands. She didn't write much anymore. Life had gotten busy, noisy, wonderfully full. But that night she felt called to reflect, to try and capture the intangible. She wrote, "There are things we're taught to believe about wildness, that it's separate, that it's dangerous, that it must be controlled or avoided. But maybe wildness isn't something we're meant to fence out. Maybe, sometimes, it's something we're meant to meet, with reverence. Maybe wildness is not the absence of relationship, but the presence of mystery." Luna never asked for trust. She never demanded affection. She gave what she gave when she chose to. And that, in its way, taught me more about love than I ever expected. She reminded me that connection isn't forged through control, but through quiet coexistence, through stillness, through simply showing up, day after day, even when the world can't explain why you're there. Claire closed the journal and looked out into the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Luna stirred, then settled again, her golden eyes flickering in the dark. There were still days when Claire questioned whether she'd made the right choice bringing Luna home. There would always be people who thought the risk was too great, that the line between wild and domestic should never be blurred. But for Claire, the line hadn't blurred. It had deepened. She didn't see Luna as tamed or trained or transformed. She saw her as she had always been, wild, whole, and wonderfully herself. What had changed wasn't Luna. It was the space around her, the trust allowed to grow there. The thread, invisible but undeniable, stretching between beings who had every reason not to connect, and did anyway. That was the story she hoped people would remember. Not the attack, not the headline, but the in-between. The dozens of tiny, almost invisible choices that built a bridge between species. The slow unfolding of respect, the moment a bobcat stayed by a child instead of walking away. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes a family. Not similarity, not language, not biology, but choice. The choice to remain, to return, to risk, and above all, to care. Claire stood and walked inside, the porch light casting her shadow long across the floor. Behind her, Luna blinked once more, then tucked her head beneath her paw. They didn't need words. They never had. And though the world outside would keep trying to categorize what had happened between them, to define it or replicate it or explain it away, Claire knew one simple truth would remain. Love doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it wears spots. Sometimes it watches quietly from the trees, and sometimes, when you least expect it, it protects what it never had to, simply because it wanted to. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story touched something in you, consider sharing it, because the world needs more reminders that even across the wildest distances, connection is still possible. And sometimes, the invisible threads are the strongest ones of all.